Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. Today is the 3rd of December and I'm going to talk you through some of the latest concerning the peace negotiations taking place between, well, really the Americans and the Russians, with a side helping of the occasional Ukrainian bit of input and the EU. So a lot has been taking place because there were these discussions in Florida between the Ukrainians and the Americans, and there's been sort of EU trying to get involved, and then Witkoff and Kushner went across to the Kremlin to speak to the Russians, but en route stopped off to speak to Zelensky and Umarov in Ireland, and then was supposed to meet Zelensky on the way back, but that's now fallen through. The TLDR is that the Americans are playing the Russian game, the Putin game here, and they are doing exactly what Putin wants them to do, and this will either result in a delay or with the Americans forcing onto the Ukrainians something that they don't want to adhere to, the kind of maximalist objectives of the Russians. So that's the direction of travel. Let's get into the details. Before we do so, please remember to like, subscribe, and share as always, just to keep up to date with all that is going on in Ukraine. That would be fantastic. And let's now get to the details of the peace negotiations. Okay, so to start with, we had Putin kind of rarely these days coming out and speaking to the press yesterday, talking a lot about the peace negotiations. He said Europe puts forward peace plan that suggests Europe puts forward peace plan suggestions that are unacceptable for Russia. Again, putting Europe up against the United States here. I think this is very clever of Putin, seeing and claiming that Europe are the obstacle to peace here, that these are these warmongering states. And do you know what? I can imagine there are people in, say, the US, in the MAGA in isolationist sphere, that would be like, yeah, they just want war, not thinking at all that Russia are the ones that invaded. The Russians clearly want war. If they didn't want war, they just need to remove their troops from Ukraine. Like, we must remember at all points that Russia desperately wants this war to continue as well. Anyway, he said Russia supposes Europeans will be able to return to negotiations if they take into account the realities on the ground. So this claim that Russia are prevailing on the battlefield. Anton Gerashenko says Europe is an integral part of the peace negotiations, though, because this is about security on the European continent. The unacceptable suggestions are basically Ukraine's sovereignty. That's really what Russia wants the Ukrainians to give away. Or the Americans to extract from the Ukrainians their sovereignty. Now, for the second day in a row, says Andriy Sybiha, the foreign minister for Ukraine, Putin makes statements that demonstrate that he does not plan to end the war. Yesterday, he said he was prepared to fight through the winter. Today, he threatens seaports and freedom of navigation. So this is the response to the tankers being hit. Putin said, if Ukraine continues to do this, we will stop all exports coming out of Odessa, that will just hammer Odessa into oblivion. And Sybiha says, and these threats are directed first and foremost at Odessa, which President Trump spoke about with a lot of warmth. Russia must end the bloodshed it has started. If this doesn't happen and Putin just spits into the world's face once again, there must be consequences. Russia must stop wasting the world's time, which must be the time for peace. We fully support all fair efforts that can bring a fair peace. The teams of Ukraine and the United States, together with our European partners, have worked a lot and achieved important progress. Now it is time to force the source of war in Moscow to end it, which is absolutely correct. But I don't know how much account will be paid to that statement by Trump, for example. Now, talking about Putin's war game that the US is playing, Politico has the title of one of their articles now, "We're not further from peace. Kushner and Witkoff step into Putin's war game. So the quote, we're not further from peace. Now, I'm going to talk about Kushner in a second. The fact that Kushner is involved in this process at all says only one thing, and Witkoff as well, let's be honest, says only one thing, that the US is interested in business and not peace, which is what the Wall Street Journal said the other day. But actually, Kushner's continued position at the table is a massive indication that this is about business. And of course, grifting for Trump's own family, as he's the son-in-law of Trump. This is nepotism of the highest order. Putin made Trump's representatives wait for several hours while he himself accused Europe of disrupting the peace process and hinted at a new escalation. Only then did he allow them into the Kremlin. This was another example of Putin keeping people waiting. He's famous for this in terms of speeches, meetings, all sorts. He will so often leave leaders waiting for him as a power play to suggest, I am the one in control. You operate to my timescale. We had this previously with, I believe, Witkoff, where he had to wait hours and hours and hours at a previous meeting with Trump. Now we hear that Witkoff and Kushner and their delegation had to wait hours for the meeting with Putin yesterday in the Kremlin before being allowed to see him. So I would hope that these two, Witkoff and Kushner, would understand that they are being played by that kind of behavior, but they just seem to be in awe. Particularly Witkoff seems to be in awe of Putin. It's deeply upsetting. Now, NBC News reported yesterday that Russia will not make concessions on these 3 points of the, quote, Trump peace plan: the territory of Donbass, limiting the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, and the recognition of new regions by the US and Europe as Russian territories. These are the Ukrainian red lines. Russia is saying they will not make concessions on these points. We are back to where we were 10 months ago. This is an intractable situation. Trump and his team need to understand this, that there can be no negotiations, successful negotiations, unless Russia is forced to the table, because they will keep on and on about their maximalist objectives. They want the Donbass, and I'm going to do a whole video on why Ukraine cannot give up the Donbass. Cannot. So this is totally understandable that Donbass is a red line for the Ukrainians. It absolutely is the obstacle to further Russian advances towards Kyiv. The amount of fortifications that the Ukrainians have built in the Donbass means that any further advances for the Russians would come at huge costs unless they're given it by the Americans. And if they're given it by the Americans, then that is a massive win for the Russians. The Ukrainians cannot give away Donbass. Okay, so that's one. Limiting the size of the AFU, that's taking away Ukraine's sovereignty without Russia having to concede anything. Russia are the aggressors here. They attacked Ukraine. If anyone needs to reduce the size of their army, it is the country that is doing the attacking, not the defenders. So that is absolutely should be a red line. And recognition of new regions by the US and Europe as Russian territories, if that's a de jure recognition, a legal recognition, then you are condoning and not just accepting, but you're condoning you're rewarding the aggressive invasion of bully nations. And you are saying to basically people like China or any country around the world, if you're strong enough and you want to invade another country, we're fine with that. We will eventually legally recognize the land that you steal. So there's absolutely no surprise that Ukraine has their red lines here with these three, but Russia have their own red lines there. And you don't solve this until one of the two nations is absolutely forced to, on their knees, to do that. Now, it looks like the United States wants to force Ukraine to its knees, that they are wielding undue pressure on Ukraine as the victim here. Like, the US is still involved in, or the Trump administration is still involved in victim blaming and in having the bully win. This is absolutely unacceptable. Now, the analyst says not quite open source, but literally an analyst on military analyst on Blue Sky, who's called the analyst, says Putin blames Europe for proposal modifications. So what he's saying is that America is ready to give him what he wants, but Europe, the place the war is taking place in, and which threatens the existence of Europe at an existential level. Anyway, Europe, along with Ukraine itself, these are the defenders of the West. They are the ones that are being blamed. They are the ones that are the obstacles, as I said earlier, to peace negotiations, to successful peace negotiations. Analyst says Putin blames us, the Europeans, for spoiling his party. We were delighted. That smug look of satisfaction Putin portrays as America begs him for a deal is Europe plus and Ukraine, who forced a reality check. Putin is always like this arrogant, entitled look at me, I'm all powerful creature. Trump is so enamored by. Yet he has almost no cards left. His country is collapsing quietly but quickly behind him. Latest Levada polls show 58% now oppose the war inside Russia. They've had enough. It's going to get worse. Ukraine is leveling the Russian economy, and Putin's cards are valueless. We should treat him that way, not like some infallible potentate with godly powers. He's a shell of what he was, and we must treat him accordingly. So that's one sort of view. But I think Putin is projecting this persona of strength to the right people, to Witkoff. I'll keep you waiting. I'm the strong guy. We hold all the cards. To Kushner and to Trump. Trump says Zelensky doesn't have any cards. Actually, Zelensky keeps showing that he does have cards. And in fact, the Russians are still just trying to do the same thing that they've been doing all throughout this war without a huge amount of success. And yet, Trump is still enamored by Putin. That's what the analyst was saying there. And it's really frustrating. Now, according to the Kremlin, the Witkoff and Putin talks on ending Russia's war in Ukraine were, quote, very useful. Russian negotiator Kirill Dmitriev described the talks as productive. Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov added that the meeting was, quote, very useful, constructive, and highly substantive. But no deal was reached, of course, because both sides are intransigent for, well, one side for good reason, the other side for imperialistic, genocidal reasons. Now, as someone has pointed out, Max25 here, among others, have pointed out, this was Steve Witkoff on the left when he was with the Ukrainians, looking miserable, haggard, and not happy with having to, I guess, listen to the moral proclamations of Ukraine and the red lines that they have. But he goes to see Putin and suddenly he's a happier man. He does seem to like himself a bit of Putin. The body language whenever he meets Putin, almost like hugs and the smiles, and he puts his hand on his heart that time as well. Absolutely unacceptable, in my opinion, for someone negotiating with a dictator on behalf of the rules-based norms of Western society. Now, we're going to pop along to the rest of this politics and Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, two British political pundits now, who talk about Jared Kushner's involvement here. And honestly, I was talking about this earlier. This is so freaking important. I was almost going to do a whole video on what the hell is Jared Kushner doing involved in the peace negotiations.
So, I mean, I would suggest that it is utterly abnormal that Jared Kushner's there. He's his son-in-law. We know that when he was very close to Trump in the White House in the first term, he became a multi-billionaire on the back of deals done whilst being responsible for and getting praise from Trump for helping deliver the Abraham Accords. This sort of fusion of money and power.
I was talking to one of the ambassadors who was in Washington at the time. And I said, what was Jared Kushner like? And he said it was completely terrifying. Every time he went in as the ambassador from his country to seat Jared Kushner, who then had an official position in the US government, half the meeting would be about business deals. Kushner would basically...
Half of any meeting from an ambassador with Jared Kushner was about business. But this is business that benefits Kushner himself personally. You see what's happened since Trump 1.0 when he was envoy to the Middle East, and he now has he got how many billions from the Saudis for his hedge fund? Came out of nowhere. 2 billion, just out of nowhere. Jared Kushner suddenly has 2 billion quid or dollars, and then you've got all these Trump Trump hotel deals going up left, right, and centre. You've got Serbia. Look at what's going on in Serbia. It is honestly, it's outrageous that Jared Kushner has anything to do with anything in US diplomacy.
Basically said, well, let's stop talking about whatever kind of geopolitical issue we're talking about. By the way, I'd like to do this deal. Do you think you could help facilitate my business deal?
So the situation today,
do this deal, talking about whatever the meeting would be about business deals. Kushner had an official position in the US government. Half the meeting would be about business deals. Kushner would basically say, well, let's stop talking about whatever kind of geopolitical issue we're talking about. By the way, I'd like to do this deal. Do you think you could help facilitate my business deal?
So the situation today, Putin's there. Putin, as we've said many times, he hasn't really changed his position at all. He occasionally drops hints that he might. Trump then celebrates and says we're on the cusp of a deal, and then Putin just pushes in the same direction. And the point you made about Europe, this goes back to what I think was one of the most consequential moments of the year, J.D. Vance's Munich speech.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia. What I worry about is the threat from within.
Sometimes you've got to take these people at face value. That was him saying, you lot don't really matter to us. The idea that they're working for peace in Ukraine in the same way that Keir Starmer, Merz, Macron Tusk think they are working for peace, they're operating in a completely different lens. And the fact that Rubio, who has actually, I think, been more sensible. I mean, it was interesting when they met the newly formed Ukrainian negotiating team, because Zelensky's lost his chief of staff, Yermak, through this corruption scandal. But he met the new team, and it was a pretty high-powered Ukrainian team. And there's Rubio sitting there, because he's the Secretary of State, flanked by Witkoff and Jared Kushner. That was the American team. It's all about the business deals.
Witkoff famously being the golfing partner. I mean, this is the real thing that we don't keep. I mean, the reason he's so trusted is that he was one of Trump's favorite golfing buddies.
The reason why Witkoff would be a very good golfing partner is because to be a good golfing partner for Trump, you have to be willing to lose every game that you play, and you have to be able to turn the blind eye when Trump hits the ball into the rough or into a bunker, and then miraculously that ball moves via the caddy's pocket into the middle of the fairway, and then you have to say, great shot, Mr. President. And that is what makes you a good golfing partner.
And he refuses to use secure telephones. He insists on using unsecure mobile telephones for the most classified details of the Russian negotiations.
And we hear, obviously, we heard the leaks the other day of those, the telephone conversations that were released by Bloomberg. Apparently, there are more to come. So we hear. So expect some more telephone conversations from unsecured telephone discussions between Steve Witkoff and, I don't know, Dmitriev, Ushakov, whoever.
One of the European security agencies tried to reprimand him and said, could you please use a secure line? He said, no, I find it very inconvenient that machinery takes too long to set up. He doesn't inform the US government. When Witkoff was doing prisoner release, he didn't tell the CIA, which is actually in charge of that type of prisoner release, that he was doing it. The US Treasury only found out about the fact that he was deciding to suddenly lift sanctions on this man, Kirill Dmitriev, who was banned from visiting the US, to bring him in after the event. It's the British that had to tell US officials what Witkoff is up to in Moscow sometimes. I mean, and Kellogg, who's the general,
he's gone.
Serious figure who was doing the Ukraine stuff, has announced he's out. And as you say, Paul Rubio has become this figure, a bit like Rex Tillerson, who was the Secretary of State in the first Trump administration. Rubio is on the right of the Republican Party, but he is becoming now, and is being sidelined because he's seen as the voice of the establishment, because he's at least listening a little bit to the State Department, listening a little bit to the CIA, listening a little bit to experienced generals, trying to make the normal arguments that America has made for 80 years. And as a result, he's treated as a joke.
I thought one of the most interesting moments, though, in that meeting the other day was when Rubio used the words sovereign and independent about Ukraine. Witkoff looked physically ill. The social media was flooded with these pictures of Witkoff just looking like he'd been forced to eat the most disgusting food imaginable.
But then who wins in that?
Nobody. It's just the next chapter. Just the next chapter in the show.
Exactly. And presumably Trump, given a decision to choose between, I don't know, Rubio and Witkoff, or let's say Rubio and an extraordinary series of wonderful rare earth and mineral deals with what he believes is the great superpower of Russia, will choose the latter, right?
One day this war will come to an end, because in the end, all wars do come to an end. But it will only come to an end if both sides decide that there's nothing more to be gained from fighting. We're nowhere near that yet, nowhere near it. And the idea that that plan is the basis to stop it is just completely for the birds.
There's also some very interesting...
Completely for the birds. Like this plan, whether it's any of these plans around at the moment, because of those red lines, it's for the birds, because Russia won't agree to those red lines and Ukraine won't agree to the removal of those red lines. And that means that it will continue, because there's not enough convincing either side that they need to finish this war.
Reporting on drones again, and the way that Russian is currently using new generation.
So anyway, I was wondering if there was more there. We'll leave that there and then go to Rubio and see what he has to say. Now, there's almost a 3-minute video here. I won't go into the full 3 minutes, won't play the full 3 minutes, but pick out a few aspects from this interview that he's just done with Fox. Theoretically, he says, by doing the right things in 10 years, Ukraine's GDP will surpass Russia's GDP. Rubio is now talking so often about Ukraine's economic potential, and this is aligning himself annoyingly with the Trump approach of we need to make money out of this, and it's all about economic prosperity, first and foremost US prosperity, but we can maybe get Ukraine to sign up to these deals by focusing not on justice, not on strategic a strategic understanding of the geography, but actually just on the economics of it all. And this is going back to the idea that now, well, it would be Witkoff and Kushner, but you could argue Rubio is getting tainted by this as well. They're playing the Putin game. Like, Putin knows what is going to tick Trump's boxes. An appeal to an economically prosperous future. So he just says, well, we can do these deals, those deals, rare earths in Russia, blah blah blah, hydrocarbons. Trump is like, yeah, brilliant, that's fantastic. Whether that's ever going to happen or not is another matter, because he's basically getting Trump on side. And then when Ukraine is refusing to shift their red lines, Trump gets annoyed with Ukraine. And you have Kushner and Witkoff delivering back to Trump, and therefore to the Ukrainians and the rest of the world, these Putin demands, but dressed up in economic language. And you end up having Trump being manipulated really by Putin. And all of these three, Rubio, Witkoff, and Kushner, are just playing Putin's game. That article by Politico, spot on. We're not further from peace. Kushner and Witkoff step into Putin's war game. You may claim you're not further from peace, but you are being manipulated by the master manipulator there. So again, to talk in terms of the economic language that we're hearing, Secretary of State Marco Rubio says that if Ukraine takes the right steps, its GDP could surpass Russia's within 10 years. They are literally fighting over 30 to 50 kilometer strip in Donetsk, roughly 20% of the region still under Ukrainian control, and now a central issue in negotiations. Now, that's a 6,000 square kilometer area. That is insanely important, heavily fortified. Just go and look at the mapping by Kremlin and others, and actually there's no fortifications outside of that area. So once you get out that strip of land he's talking about, there's no fortifications. If you give that away to the Russians, there's no need for the Russians to fight for it. That huge attritional work they have to do to take control of that land, because it is so heavily fortified. And then there's no fortifications thereafter. So then you would give that to the Russians, and then they'd wait 6 months, a year, and then carry on going into Ukraine. It's just, if Marco Rubio is starting to play this game, then all is lost for Ukraine in terms of having the Americans on board to help negotiate, because they are just doing what Putin wants them to do. Rubio here says there are people who think that we should just talk to the Ukrainian side and not talk to the Russians at all. You can't end the war without talking to Russia, but you also have to take into account the Ukrainian position. It's that last part that's super important. Yeah, you can talk to the Russians, but don't side with the Russians. Quote, they fought very bravely, but we think this is the perfect time for both sides to end the war, and there's a way to bridge a gap between them. We're the only ones in the world who can do it. Yes, you can, but you're not doing it the right way. You should be pressuring Russia, pressure the aggressor. Pressure the people who have committed all the war crimes and are breaking international law and UN charters, so on and so forth. You need to be pressuring Russia to the hilt to come to the table, but you're not. You're pressuring Ukraine and leaving Russia to dictate to you what they think should happen in the peace negotiations. If they decide they don't want to end the war will continue. Yeah. I also don't think that Russia will be able to continue this war for another 4 to 5 years. After all, you know, in the case of Russia, only Putin makes a decision, not his advisors. Only Putin can end this war from the Russian side. So I think we will look for ways. That bit meaningless gump that. So here we have Ushakov. When asked how the prospects for peace have changed after the negotiations of Witkoff and Kushner and going to the Kremlin, it hasn't exactly moved away. Ushakov said that the possibility of a meeting with Putin and Trump, quote, will depend on the progress made on the path to settlement. But again, you know, not really an awful lot, no concessions at all, not an awful lot of budging from Russia in any way, shape or form. Now, Alex Rafuglu, the journalist, says, initially, Scoop, 2 sources with direct knowledge confirmed to me that President Zelensky is slated to meet in Brussels with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. That would be last night following their Moscow visit. And then he later said, update, the Brussels meeting is called off, according to sources. Zelensky is returning home. Kremlin claims that Witkoff and Kushner promised to head directly to Washington after talks with Putin. So this looks like the Kremlin dictated to Witkoff and Kushner that they couldn't meet Zelensky on the way back to Washington and had to go directly back to Washington. So Witkoff and Kushner went, yes, dear master, we'll do that. Yes, we won't meet with Zelensky. No, we won't, dear master. And those two scoot off back to Washington to deliver the Putin's demands to Trump. Now, a report says Witkoff and Kushner have cancelled their planned meeting with Zelensky in Brussels, according to Euronews. The Kremlin claims the Trump envoys promised to return directly to Washington after talks with Putin, skipping any follow-up with the Ukrainian side, listening to their master. Analyst says the whole thing is shameful. They have no right to demand anything of Ukraine. It's time we all learned that lesson and acted accordingly. So the Ukrainian Security Council Secretary Umerov and General Hnatov will meet in Brussels with EU national security advisors. Zelensky's confirmed they'll brief them on what was learned from the recent US-Russia talks in Moscow and discuss Europe's role in Ukraine's future security architecture. Again, I can't see this going any other direction than the US having less and less to do with these negotiations, unless the US are going to be more serious on pressuring Russia. You know, Europe are going to have to say, look, it's all going to be on us. But the problem, like I've said to you many times, is the more they do that, the more the US will go, okay, we'll lift sanctions on Russia. You guys do it on your own, but we're not going to be a part of this. And then that's counterproductive. No Reports here talks about a Pete Hegseth and, you know, this loving picture of him and his wife together, as you can see here, but an interview with Pete Hegseth. US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth says he wants Putin, Trump and Zelensky at one table for a peace dinner, complete with steaks and a salad with, quote, with Russian dressing. Hard to take seriously at a moment when Ukraine is fighting for its survival, says No Reports. Hegseth is mentally ill and above all dangerous. I mean, this, though, gives you a window into really what's going on. I mean, I think a kind of laughing Hegseth talking about having a steak dinner with Putin shows you how these guys do not see Putin as a bad guy. You have Steve Witkoff saying to Tucker Carlson, I don't see Putin as a bad guy. He's a fecking genocidal dictator who is responsible for countless war crimes and should be in The Hague. How can you sit there and be so blithely positive about such an evil human being? But that tells you that these guys aren't serious about any moral, political outcome here. They are just interested in doing business deals. And you've got a situation where there was a cabinet meeting that was like apparently like pulling teeth yesterday. While Rubio was talking about war with Ukraine, Trump just fell asleep.
Coalition of countries behind the peace deal, behind the border peace, and it's still an everyday challenge, but it's been driven personally.
So obviously someone creating a video with a bit of a piss take there of kids like sleeping music as Trump is asleep at the table while Marco Rubio's talking about Ukraine. That's how seriously Trump takes it. He's too old to be running the show, let's face it. So he did have something to say on Ukraine, and here is part of it.
But we're trying to get that settled. I've settled 8 wars.
No, you haven't.
This would be the 9th.
No,
people are over in Russia right now to see if we can get it settled. Not an easy situation. Let me tell you, what a mess. It's a war that never would have happened if I were president. We're trying to get that.
So what he's telling you is exactly what he's told you a million times before, and it's completely pointless. Shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. You literally don't know what you're talking about, and you are lying to whoever's listening. But some very revealing things he said as well. The US is no longer financially involved in the war between Ukraine and Russia. They have no horse in this race anymore. In that case, bugger off. Okay, NATO member states can still buy stuff off the US through the Pearl Initiative, but you've got no horse in the race. Okay, does that mean that you're a better position to be mediators here? But you're not mediating. You are advocating for Russia's position very clearly and very often. So Max25 here then quotes Trump saying, a lot of money from the US was given to Ukraine in cash. I'm not giving anything away anymore. Biden gave away 350 billion like candy. No, he didn't. Another lie. Europeans are now buying weapons from the US at full cost for further transfer to Ukraine, says Trump. So whoop-de-doo, we're selling stuff to NATO at full cost. Actually, previously he said a 10% markup. So, they're profiteering off the war. We're truly respected, said Trump. When I came to the NATO summit, they called me the president of Europe. No, they didn't. The delusion of this man knows no bounds. So anyway, yet again, we shouldn't be relying on the Trump administration and the US in these negotiations. Now, the president of Ukraine has come out and said, look, the Russians started the war, and there are no alternatives to this wording. The whole world is a witness. They came with aggression to destroy us. We stopped them. Europe helped. America helped. Russia hasn't managed to occupy Ukraine because of the strength of the Ukrainian people, our partners. We fully support the US saying enough bloodshed, but we must end this war in such a way that a year from now, Russia doesn't come back with a third invasion. It may happen because that was their main goal. I mean, he shouldn't have to say this stuff, but like the wording indicates that the United States, the Trump administration, appears to be going through this kind of alternate reality scenario whereby they're making up their own facts. And you keep having to stop and say, look, but just to remind people, Russia did start the war. You do remember that, yeah? They are the aggressors. They have illegally invaded another country. Yeah, the Russians started the war, and there are no alternatives to this wording. The whole world is a witness. Well, we've got it on camera. They literally started the war. Please remember this. And then we have Mark Rutte, the Secretary General for NATO, come out today and saying it's important that the peace process is there. Hopefully it will lead to results. The best way to put pressure on Russia is, one is making sure that you Russians understand the flow of weapons into Ukraine will keep going. And secondly, making sure the economic sanctions bite. And of course, that's super important. And that's where the US should be operating to bring Russia to its knees and force Putin to the table. But yet again, we're back at the situation where Witkoff and Kushner aren't at all interested in a just and lasting peace. They're interested in economic deals. We know the character of Kushner from Trump 1.0. We know what he's like in these deals, and Witkoff is just the same. He's a real estate mogul. What the freaking hell are these two involved in trying to do peace deals with Ukraine? Marco Rubio is the only adult in the room, but even he's having to change his tune in accordance with the Trumpian worldview. And Europeans are left trying to keep the US on side enough that they don't go off-piste and formally join the bad guys. So we're still in the mess we're in. last time I spoke to you about this, but there'll be more meetings, and Putin is just successfully stringing the American administration along. The Trump administration, with his idiot lackeys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, are being strung along by Putin. All the while, they're probably making an absolute killing off it. So maybe they're not idiots. Maybe this is absolutely intended by those two. They are just in it for themselves, just as Trump is in it for himself. No one in the Trump administration appears to be in it for the Ukrainians and for justice and for the rules-based world order. They appear to be right down the list of concerns. It's just about making money, and there you go. Anyway, that's enough from me. I appreciate your support. Thank you very much for watching, for listening, and just take a second to like, subscribe, and share, especially if you want to keep ahead of what is going on in these crazy times. Please subscribe to the channel. Take care. Oh, and also pop along to atpgeo.com/donate, and you will be able to help our fundraiser with Jigger's Paw to get ATVs, quads to people who need them. So thank you very much for those who have helped out there. Take care. I'll speak to you soon.